Alright, so we've got our seedling tray, our cell tray that we're going to use, a 72. And we have our soil mix. Oh, we have to get the propagation, the potting mix out. So, this is a typical bale of soil that you get from a nursery supplier. They also sell smaller bags, like 20-pound bags of soil. This weighs around, anywhere from 50 to 80 pounds, depending on how wet it is. So it's a heavy, compressed bale of soil. What I'm going to do is open it up and use it to start mixing. Now, now one thing about the pandemic is everyone has these days, and even before COVID, we would always use or recommend using a mask when you're dealing with potting mix, because it's not good to breathe the dust from it. It can it gets into your boogers first of all, and then it can, over time, if you get prolonged exposure to potting soil mix, it can cause some respiratory issues that you just don't need to have to deal with. So you should always wear a mask when you're mixing soil. So I'm going to cut it open. Okay. So this is our what comes inside of a soil bale. It's usually compressed, and this is our Pro Mix. Like I was saying, it's coarser material. What we're going to do is we're going to use the Pro Mix as to fill the bottom of the tray, and then we're going to top it off with the Propagation mix after we sow our seeds. So I'm going to fill this bucket up with soil, and I'm going to wet it so that it's ready for the seeds. Fill the bucket up. So obviously, if you're going to be mixing a lot of this soil, you can, if you're doing a lot of these trays, you'd want a larger container than this. If you have a greenhouse bench, you can pour a lot of it out and then mix it there. So as it starts out here, the soil has some coarse chunks in it, some coarse particles. You want to break those down and make it kind of loose. So we're going to use this. You can use a trowel or a spatula or something to kind of break those chunks up, pulverize them a little bit, so that the seedling cells will be filled nicely, and you don't want any giant air gaps in it. So I'm going to first start by pulverizing, and then we're going to mix in the water when we get most of the larger conglomerates broken up. It's like making pancakes. And obviously, the larger the container, the easier it is to mix. It's a little tight in here. So it's getting pretty good. This is a decent consistency. There's nothing really big left now, and based on how the color of it is, it has a little bit of moisture. It's a little damp. It's damp to the touch, but we want it to be a little more moist than it is here, and I'll explain exactly why when I start to add the water. So peat moss, which is the main component of this, is what's known as hydrophobic. It's afraid of water. Since I'm not mixing right now, I'm going to take the mask off for a second. This material will repel water when it's dry. Once you start to mix water into it, eventually the water will infiltrate into the pore spaces of the peat moss, and it will start to absorb water and swell. But right now, since it's mostly dry, the peat moss has contracted, and if you try to pour water on it, if you were to put it in a tray like this and put your seeds in and try to pour water on it, the water will run off the top, and it won't actually wet down into the bottom of the tray, of the cell. It'll stay in the top level and just kind of sit there for a while, and you'll have to probably water it 3 or 4 times before the water actually gets to the point where it infiltrates into the cell tray, into the cell. So to cut out that step and to make sure that that every cell that we put a seed into has enough water, we're going to water the mix before we put it in. That's a big part of seeding, is making sure that your seeding mix has water. So as you see here, it kind of puddles up a little bit, but it's actually infiltrating. You see it's draining down. Watch, I'll pour a little bit more in, and you see the water kind of puddles, and it's going to slowly go down into the mix. So I'm going to pour a good amount of water in like that. That should be enough. You don't want to make it too wet and soupy, because then it will it will be too heavy and it won't be easily to handle. It's kind of, you have to find a sweet spot, and that just takes a little bit of experience to do. And it all depends really on how moist your potting mix is to begin with. There's no set in stone rule of how much water you need to add per bucket of soil or per bale of soil. It depends on each individual bale. Some will be moister than others. So I'm going around, stirring, and you see what happens. It starts to clump back together again. But you can see this is dry. You want these particles to get the moisture into them too. So it takes a good deal of mixing and stirring. But eventually you'll get it all to a good consistency. Chop it up a little bit to break up those moist chunks. And it doesn't have to be completely homogenized. You can have some little dry pockets, as long as most of it is nice and moist. You'll know that it's too moist, for example, if you take a clump of soil and you squeeze it and water starts to drip out. See, I'm squeezing it pretty hard, there's no water coming out. That's good. If I was to squeeze it and it would drip water like a sponge, that means it's got too much water, and you want to add more dry peat moss or pro mix to it. So it's pretty good. The color is dark. It's got a nice dark color. It feels damp to the touch, and so that's how I know that this soil is moistened enough, and it still is fluffy. So that's all good signs. You have a pretty wide range of moisture that you can have in here for it to be suitable for planting. So since this is ready, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill my tray. Just to step back, if you have any kind of potting tray, any kind of cell tray, you want to put like a holding tray underneath it, because you see this thing is floppy. When you fill it with soil, it's going to want to sag, and you can even break. It's a very flimsy material, so you give it a little bit of a reinforcement so that it stays flat and strong, and that so when you go to water it, everything is more or less level. So I always put trays under this, even with the 50s, any kind of cell tray. It's good to have some backing underneath it. So the easy way to fill this tray is you just simply pour the soil over it. If you're filling a lot of trays, what I would do is I would set a bunch of them up together and pour all over all of them. But I'm just doing one, so I'm going to just pour it. You could even let it pile up and then spread the rest out with your hands. So pour it in. Okay, let's see where that soil gets us. So I'm very gently raking it into the other cells. I don't want to make a big mess on my table, even though that's kind of what the table's for. But I'm still trying to keep as much of the soil in the on the tray and in the cells as possible. So I'm using this hand to kind of, stop it from overflowing and spilling out, because I'm gonna have to pick it up anyway and put it back in. So I got most of this, and then you can take a little pot after you get most of it and just use that to kind of fill them up nice, get them level, skim off the soil. Now, I took special care in this case not to press the soil into the cells, because when you do that, you compress the potting mix, which we are going to do, but we're going to do that in a certain way so that it remains uniform. So for this part, there's several ways to do this. You can actually take another 72, right? So I've got some over here. By the way, when you're stacking and storing these trays, you'll notice that I didn't stack them directly one on top of the other. I staggered them. That's because when you stack them into each other, there's so much friction that goes on between the trays that it's hard to separate sometimes, especially when they're a little wet. So what we did was we made it so you can grab one end and separate it easily. That's a little trick, because if you stack them in like that, you'll wind up breaking a lot of them. So I did it that way. So one way of compressing the soil is just by putting another identical tray on top of it and just lightly pressing it in, and you'll feel it go down. So if you see what I did there, I compressed it a bit. Now, if you're new to filling these trays, sometimes you'll put less soil in the holes than in the cells than others. So the centers generally get filled up really well. It's the sides and corners that usually get the short end of everything, whether it's water or soil. Sides like this, and the corners dry out the fastest because you usually don't water them as well, and the middles tend to get overwatered or at least adequately watered. So as you can see, this one's a bit deeper than one in the middle. And I didn't press it very hard. It could actually go a little further. So I'm going to show you, since I did the initial pressing, there's one other way, or one other step into compacting the soil enough so that it's good for the plant, and that's just dropping it. So I always cover it, but when I do this, because it will make a mess, the soil will tend to jump up. So what I do is I just take it from about this height and just drop it like that a couple times. Now it doesn't show too much of an impact, but it's firm. When I push down on one of these cells, it shouldn't go down. It should rebound a little bit. So you see how it comes back a little bit? Well, that one came down, but you see it starts to come back up just a little bit. That's how you know it's good. It has a good level of compression. What I'm going to do last is fill just a little bit on these corners. They feel like they're a little bit low, but everything else is pretty good. You know, some of these need a little more. So I'll just hand fill. Take my little container, fill it up, and press it down with my finger. Doesn't need much, and this doesn't have to be perfect either. At this point, most of the cells have a good amount of soil, and they'll be just fine. It's just for the purpose of illustrating what the ideal or almost ideal tray should look like. So these are pretty good. Okay, so before we start to put our seeds in here, just remember that we are going to top these trays off with this propagation mix, which is very fine. You can see it's so fine it's actually falling through the bottom holes of this pot. So you know, that's going to be the topic. So with the Pro Mix is just the base where the roots are going to grow, and then this covers the seeds and keeps them moist and warm while they're starting to grow. So this is the packet of pak choi. It's a lovely vegetable. It does well in cool seasons. And then if you look at it on the back, it'll tell you the conditions that the plant likes. So it likes full sun. It takes 45 days to harvest, which can be confusing to some people because you think, well, today is November 17th, and so in 45 days I'm going to have my pak choi that's this size. That's not actually true. If you were to plant it into the ground under ideal conditions, then you can rely on more or less 45 days from emergence, from when the seed emerges. When you plant seeds in flats, usually that days to maturity or days to harvest refers to after you transplant from your flat into the ground. So that's the difference. If you direct seed it into the ground, that's you're going to get that number of days. But if you put it in cell trays, the number of days comes from when you put that mature sized choy plant into the ground. So and then it also tells you the depth of seeding. So it says 1/4 inch. A 1/4 inch is generally a very good depth for most vegetable seeds and flower seeds. If it's a lot smaller of a seed, you might go less. You might surface seed it. But most vegetables have big seeds, and a 1/4 inch is good for them. It says 12 inches spacing, so that means that when you plant these out, you want 12 inches between plants. If you have multiple rows, you want your rows to be 12 inches apart, and within the rows, you want 12-inch spacing. So it takes up about 1 square foot per plant, which is about right for the full mature size of this plant. And if you're growing in containers, which you can, it says 1 plant per 12-inch pot. So that's basically the same thing. What I'm going to do here is show you a little bit of our record keeping, and this form I made for our nursery production. We deal with a lot of different types of plants and seeds, and so we have to keep records of when we seed them and the varieties and how many. So I'm going to show you an example of this. What you want to have on your forms, if you're keeping records, we can cross these ones off because that's not applicable to what we're working with here. But so the main things you want are your date, the date that you're seeding. Here I have scientific name, but you could just put your vegetable species or flower species name. The cultivar can be important, especially if you're doing something like eggplants, tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers. They will very often will have a cultivar name. I'm not sure. I think that this one does have a cultivar name. It's Piche. For this pepper, which I planted last spring, it's a hybrid bell pepper, Olympus. So you can evaluate how well, if you're growing different varieties, you can evaluate each one by identifying it by its cultivar and keeping note of it, because you may grow 3 different types of eggplant and one of them does really well. You're going to want to remember which one it is so you get it again or you grow it again. The seed quantity is important to know, because from there you can see how well that seed performed. If you plant 72 and you get 70, or if you plant 72 and you get 50, you'd want to make note of that. Here I have the emerge date. That's more for one of our records, but you might want to record how long it takes between seeding and emerging, so you know in the future it's something to compare it to. Although that's not very important. What's mostly important is from seeding until transplant. But generally, it takes about a month for most vegetables. And then comments if you have anything that you tried that was different. A different growing mix. You're gonna try to grow it in a different site, or etc. It's good to have an area to include comments if you want to. So just for this one, I'll put it's 11/17. This is pak choi. I'm not using the Latin name for it because I don't know that offhand. Piche. And I'm leaving this one blank because I think that this seed pack has at least 72 seeds in it. It says 500 milligrams, so I don't exactly know what that means. And I don't see anywhere on the back of it where it says how many seeds are in here. But I'm hoping it'll be at least 72. We'll see. So the other thing I almost forgot to do is you want to include a label. So on our labels, I like to put the date first and foremost, 11/17. And then pak choi. I'll write the name. And then Piche. I hope that's pronounced right. I don't know. Piche. Okay. So these are very important tools as well to have. If you don't make a form and record things in a journal format, at the very least you really should have a label on every flat and date it, because this way you'll know if in 2 weeks this flat is not germinating, it might cue you that something is wrong. And so it helps to date everything, so you know, especially if you're dealing with 10 different vegetables, you might not keep track of the date that everything was sown and when and be able to properly evaluate how well they're doing it, and if you might need to reseed, especially if it's something that you really want to grow. So that's why I date everything and write the full name. So take the tape, and I like to put it on here. If you happen to be seeding multiple types of vegetables or plants in the same tray, you can put the seeds in rows like this, and then put a tape where it ends, and then you put the next block of plants together. But for simplicity, I'm just going to show you this whole tray seeded. So I got my tag there, which could be red. And then what I want to do, and this may not seem to be too critical, but it's actually a really helpful step. I'm going to dibble the tray with my fingertips. And what I'm doing is I'm making a slight depression in the middle. I'm not pressing too hard. If you kind of wiggle your fingers a little bit, you go through, and I'm making these little depressions in each cell so that the seeds will sit ideally dead center in each cell. And this does a couple things. When the seed is dead center, the roots will spread out evenly and the plant will be easier to remove when transplanting comes. And the other thing it does is it spaces the plants evenly amongst one another so that they're not too close to each other as far as being neighbors and competing for light. So it's the ideal seedling tray. All the plants are dead center and it's uniform. And that's helpful for the health of the plant and also for transplanting. So now that's all dibbled. It goes really quickly. It's a great job for kids who have little fingers, especially if you're using 72s. But it can go really. That's a quick process. I'm going to open my pack of seeds and put one seed in each cell. That's generally the best way to do it, unless you happen to know that that your batch of seeds has low germination. But generally they're not going, if you're buying seeds, they're not going to sell seeds that have a low germination. This pack doesn't say the percentage of germination, but some companies like Johnny's will tell you that. So they did a germ test. This is an old batch of seeds. They did a germination test on January of 2020, and they found 98% of them to germinate. So I'm gonna put, if this is what I was seeding, I'd definitely put 1 per cell, because if out of 100 seedlings only 2 don't grow, that's fine. I don't need to overcompensate. Yeah, so if your seeds happen to be an old batch of seeds or seeds that you saved from the previous season and you don't know the germination rate of them, you can, and especially if you have an abundance of them, you can overseed a little bit, meaning putting 2 or sometimes even 3 seeds per cell. Sometimes I'll go along in a batch of seeds and I'll pick up a seed that looks smaller or discolored, and I'll throw 2 per cell. In that case, I'll throw it with another one just as an insurance, because you don't want blank cells in your tray. You want everything to be growing in. So what I did was I poured out almost half of this pack of seeds into my hand, and I'm going to start seeding it. So the main thing when you're seeding is to be consistent, because if I do run out of seeds, I want to be able to throw something else in this tray to use the entire tray. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to seed in rows, kind of like a typewriter, or not exactly a typewriter, but I'm going to seed this way. You don't want to just randomly start throwing seeds everywhere, because if you leave off somewhere, you're not going to be able to find where to pick up. So I'm just going to drop 1 seed in, And then I guess we can maybe even time-lapse this. If you drop 2 in sometimes, unless you're really concerned about saving every last seed, you don't necessarily have to pick it up and pull it out, you know. Sometimes that happens and it's not critical. So I left off here. What I'm doing is I'm pinching them in between my 2 fingers, and I am just rolling my thumb and forefinger together until I push one over the edge. And this takes a little bit of practice to get quick at, but eventually, see, that one got 2. It's okay. I'm probably not going to run out at this rate. That one got 2. It happens more than you expect it to. Yeah, I'm definitely going to have enough for the whole tray, so it's okay if I drop 2. There's other ways you can do it too. After I finish this row, I'll show you another method, right? Okay, so if you happen to have a hard time rolling it out of your fingers, and if the seeds are really small like these, or there's even smaller seeds like lettuce, you can assist yourself with a little tool. So what I do is I'll take the group of seeds and put it in my hand, and I think most people's hands have creases that go across the palm, so you kind of use that crease to make a channel, and then you can coax a seed down. This thing is a plastic. It's not the best material. Usually, like, wood is better. Actually, yeah, there you go. So you see that? I just push one at a time in, and it'll roll down the shoot, kind of, and they'll land in the cell. You just got to make sure that you move your hand and line up the cell. But this sometimes helps. I've done poppy seeds this way. Those are very small, as you know. And so this method works out for smaller seeds if you're having trouble. Oop, that one got 2. It takes a little more time, and like I said, if you have a wooden popsicle stick or a label, this is better. It's a better tool than this plastic. All right. Okay, cool. So half a pack did this whole tray, which is pretty cool. So I have more if I need it. So now that the tray has been fully seeded, we're going to cover it with this propagation mix. And this is dry propagation mix. I didn't mix it with any water. It's kind of a... You don't really have to get this moist like you have to get this moist, because this Pro Mix is occupying most of the volume of the cells. This is just kind of a covering. So what I'll do is I'll kind of like shake the tray a little to make sure all the seeds settle into the middle, and then I'm going to pour this over very lightly, and it's going to be approximately of a 1/4 inch covering when it's all said and done. I made sure to dibble not too hard and deep, but pak choi is actually these seeds can break through a lot. If it's a small seed like celery, celery is small, lettuce or something like that, you might want to be a little more sensitive, but a lot of plants can take about a 1/4 inch or more. That's a general recommendation. So, let's see. There's some chunks in here. Break them up. And this stuff, when you'll see how hydrophobic it is when I go to water it, it will repel the water. But I'll give it a minute to soak in, and it'll resolve itself. So now I'm just going very lightly over it. There's a stick. I took it out, and some of them could use maybe a little bit more, so I'll take a little bit. And usually it's the edges that always miss out, the edges and the corners. All right, that's pretty good. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'll give it a little shake. You'll see what's what, and that's it. Okay, so we did our first seeding of pak choi in a cell tray because we know that it's going to germinate pretty well, and it's and we know that we specifically only want about 72 of them. But there is another way of growing seeds and starting seeds in particular, and that's called mass seeding or bulk seeding, and that involves taking a whole bunch of seeds and putting them into a container or into a tray and having them grow together and separating the seedlings after they germinate. The reason why you'd want to do this over individual hand seeding is because for a couple of reasons. Mainly because you don't know the germination rate of your seed. So the two seeds I'm gonna do here are Monarda fistulosa, which is bee balm. This is from Greenbelt Native Plant Center, and so this is a native plant. I want a lot of them, and I don't know the germination rate because there was never they didn't have a germ test result on that. And the other seed I'm gonna do is this bag of tea, which is actually chamomile. Now the other reason why you'd want to do a mass seeding is in order to conserve space and heat. So for example, pepper plants and onion plants take a very long time to grow. The seeds, when they germinate, they can take a couple of months, at least 2 months, especially for peppers and onions, to grow into a size that's actually able to be planted into the ground. So the other thing with peppers is they need to be heated. Their optimal germination temperature is about 80 degrees, which is warmer than your average greenhouse, especially if you had to maintain that temperature. So if you were to start peppers from seed to be grown in the greenhouse, you might want to start the seeds in your home over a radiator or in a very warm place. So you may not have a lot of space that's 80 degrees. So if you only have a little small area, you would want to take all of your seeds and put them together in a small container that can be heated, and it would be easier to grow that many seeds. So say if I wanted to grow 100 pepper plants, that would take about 2 of these trays. But if I wanted to just get them started, I can plant easily 100 pepper plants or pepper seeds into a pot this big and heat that along with my onions or eggplant or other plants that I want to keep heated. And then when they're ready, I can transfer them into this tray, which they'll happily grow at 70 degrees or whatever your greenhouse happens to be, as long as you don't get below 32. So I'm going to do these 2 plants that way. It's a little too early in the season to do peppers, so I'm not trying to germinate any peppers right now, although that's how I would do it. And there's a couple of ways that you can do mass seeding. I'm only going to show you one of them today, and that's just the broadcast technique. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this pot up to the line with my pre-moistened Pro Mix. Don't have to worry about pressing it down too much because I'm going to dig this up pretty soon, or shortly after they germinate, and I want it to be loose and able to separate individual seedlings easily. So I'm not going to take this and press it down too hard. I just give it maybe a little pat, just so that I make sure that it's a flat surface so that the seeds can be distributed nicely. So I'll do the same thing with this pot. And one thing I actually didn't mention with the cell tray example that's also important is you don't ever want to fill your soil to the top of the pot. You always want to leave a little bit of a gap. So even in the cell trays, that's why I don't press it down and fill it up very high. You want water to be able to lay in, and you don't want soil or seeds to wash out. So I'm going to just maintain that standard here. Give myself enough buffer so that when I cover with my propagation mix, I still have some space before we're hitting the top. Just like the other, the cell tray of pak choi, I'm going to record the types of seeds I'm growing. So the date is the same for these 2. I have Monarda for here. I'll date both of these. 17 Monarda. So we'll put the tag on this one. on the side, wrap it around, that's okay. Make sure that it's not dirty because the tape might fall off and we'll all be confused. Okay, so that's done. We know what we're putting into what, so I'll start with the Monarda. The other thing, when you are seeding, it does sometimes help to keep the area that you actually plant the seeds separate from where you mix soil, because as has happened here at Citywide Nursery many times, when we seed on or near the area where we mix soil, oftentimes the soil will get brushed up and put back into the mix. And if you ever happen to spill a seed or a few seeds, you'll find our big one was echinacea. We found echinacea in so many different types of plants, and we didn't know what kind of echinacea it was, so it was like a huge source of confusion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here with my soil. These are a good deal smaller than the other seeds, and some of them, just by the looks of them, you have different colors and sizes and shapes of seeds, and that may indicate that some of them are not viable, and as opposed to the ones that are. So we just don't know how many. In my hand, don't know how many are in here and how many of that are viable. So that's why we're using the bulk seeding technique. If I was to put this into a tray of 72, I'd probably have to overseed, and it would just be a lot more extra little work. So this saves a lot of work. So what I'll do is I still want this to be an even dispersal, so I'm kind of just going to randomly move my hand and sprinkle all over this pot. And most likely this is more than enough seeds because they're so small, and we're gonna have a lot of individual plants. And if you were to do this in a regular pot and expect the plants to grow, you're gonna get a crazy chia pet looking thing, and the plants would not be able to grow in here to the full extent of their life because they're overseeded. But since we're going to separate them, this is okay. So I really actually don't think I need too many more. I'll do a little more. You don't want a thick mat of seeds. You want to make sure that the seeds have a little bit of space in between them at the very least. So this isn't a super critical plant that we absolutely need every single one. So I'm not going to try to overseed or push it too hard. So that one is done. Let's try the chamomile pack. I'm not sure how much of this I'll use, so cut it open with a scissor. And we'll see what's in here. Make sure my hand is clean of the Monarda seeds because I don't want to mix them together with the chamomile. So that's a lot of seeds, and I think if you look at them, there's some seeds in here. Not all of them look great, but there's definitely some seeds. So we're going to give them a shot. So just like the other one, I'm going to sprinkle them around. These are very small seeds. If you were to open a seed package, it would probably look very much the same as these do. The nice thing about them is they're kind of a light yellow color, so it's easy to tell how you're dispersing them. If they're dark and they blend in with the soil, it's kind of hard to see. Certain varieties of lettuce have dark seeds and some have light seeds. It's always easier to tell the light ones because they stand out. So I don't know the germination. A lot of these are not actually seeds, but we'll give this a shot. So now they're ready to be covered by their 1/4 inch of propagation mix. So I'm going to go and get a little scoop. Actually, I've got this bowl here. This is not a fancy piece of equipment. It's just a bowl we happen to have. And by hand, I'm just going to sprinkle it over these seeds. I do find it easier to keep this stuff dry, the propagation mix dry, and the pro mix wet. For covering it, it works better, but then as you see, the watering issues different. It makes it a little more difficult. So spread this. Okay, that's approximately 1/4 inch. We don't need to go too thick because these are smaller seeds, especially the chamomile. It's very small. So So the pak choi here is seeded and covered with its propagation mix, and I'm going to water it. And just watch how the water kind of puddles up and forms little beads. It's not going to mix in well with this dry propagation mix. You can see it's kind of, well, it's kind of staying in a puddle and slowly soaking in. That's an example of how hydrophobic peat moss is. So if you see, I'm watering it, and I'm keeping the water source moving. I don't want to flood any of these cells and have the soil drift over into other cells. I want to keep it so that that everything stays in its own place and doesn't flood and overflow. It's kind of, you have to be kind of gentle. But it's good to give it a good soaking, like this, and pay special attention to the edges and the corners because they usually stay the driest. Okay. Now, how do you know that you've given it enough water? That depends on the weight of the pot. The answer to your watering questions is how heavy is the pot or the container. So in this case, I can feel it. It feels pretty good and heavy. It feels like it's been watered. And the way I know how heavy it is I basically imagine this as a container, as a tray of water. Or if it's a regular pot like this little plant was hiding over here, it feels light. What you do is you envision this as if it was a cup, a drinking cup. And if you were to pour water into it blindfolded, you would know just by feeling it how much water is in the vessel or the pot by the weight of it. So what you're going for is you want it to feel like it's about at least half full. That's how you'll know. So you kind of instinctively will know by feeling the weight of a tray that it's got water in it, because based on the volume and the weight, you can feel it. Make an estimate that it feels about halfway full. Now, for the first watering before the seeds sprout, it's okay to say overwater it a little bit, so you can give it a little extra water because the mix is dry and it's the first time it's gotten wet, so it's not like you're risking keeping it wet for a long time and where you can get fungal diseases. This is the first time it's getting wetted, so it's okay to go ahead and give it a little bit extra. So it feels okay, but I'm still going to give it a little extra. Now, if you notice it's there's some bubbles coming out. That means, and you see how that dry pocket just opened up from a bubble. That means that the propagation mix has not fully wetted itself. Let's see if any more bubbles come out. Yeah, you see there are some bubbles coming out. So that means that the propagation mix is still absorbing water. And you saw how much I poured into it, and there's still dry material. That's exactly why you're supposed to mix water ahead of time with the Pro Mix. So if the whole cell was doing that, you would have a lot more watering before you can get the adequate moisture level for each cell. So we'll let it bubble up, and even though the top layer is still a little bit dry, the moisture from below eventually will work its way up into the top layer, and you'll have uniform water across throughout each cell. But that's just a function of time, basically. So now that it has enough water at this point, everything will equilibrate. What we're going to do is we're going to set it out onto the bench. Actually, we could leave it here. And at this point, there's a couple of things you can do. If you're in a greenhouse that is not well heated, you can cover this actually with clear plastic. You could use either let's see, we have some greenhouse plastic sheets that are just the plastic, and you can lay a layer over it like that, and that will keep it a little more moist and warmer as the seeds start to germinate. In our case, we don't need to do that. If you were gonna put plastic over it, you'd have to make sure that you take the plastic off as soon as you start to see seedlings germinating, because they don't want to be kept under plastic, and then the seedlings can actually rot. So you only leave plastic over when you're getting them to sprout and germinate. But in this case, it's a cool season crop. This greenhouse has some supplemental heating, and it's not too late into the winter that we actually really need to keep it extra warm. So we're not going to do that in this case.